He's having cataract surgery tomorrow at noon, so remember him in prayer. Again, we'd like to turn to the 139th Psalm. And we'll read the entire psalm. O Lord, thou hast searched me and known me. Thou knowest my downsitting and mine uprising. Thou understandest my thought afar off. Thou compassest my path and my lying down, and art acquainted with all my ways. For there is not a word in my tongue, but, lo, O Lord, thou knowest it altogether. Thou hast beset me behind and before, and laid thine hand upon me. Such knowledge is too wonderful for me. It is high, I cannot attain unto it. Whither shall I go from thy spirit? Or whither shall I flee from thy presence? If I ascend up into heaven, thou art there. If I make my bed in hell, behold, thou art there. If I take the wings of the morning and dwell in the uttermost parts of the sea, even there shall thy hand lead me, and thy right hand shall hold me. If I say, surely the darkness shall cover me, even the night shall be light about me. Yea, the darkness hideth not from thee, but the night shineth as the day. The darkness and the light are both alike to thee. For thou hast possessed my reins, thou hast covered me in my mother's womb. I will praise thee, for I am fearfully and wonderfully made. Marvelous are thy works, and that my soul knoweth right well. My substance was not hid from thee, when I was made in secret and curiously wrought in the lowest parts of the earth. Thine eyes did see my substance, yet being unperfect, and in thy book all my members were written, which in continuance were fashioned, when as yet there was none of them. How precious also are thy thoughts unto me, O God! How great is the sum of them! If I should count them, they are more in number than the sand. When I awake, I am still with thee. Surely thou wilt slay the wicked. O God, depart from me, therefore, ye bloody men. For they speak against thee wickedly, and thine enemies take thy name in vain. Do not I hate them, O Lord, that hate thee? And am not I grieved with those that rise up against thee? I hate them with perfect hatred. I count them mine enemies. Search me, O God, and know my heart. Try me and know my thoughts, and see if there be any wicked way in me, and lead me in the way everlasting. Again, in this psalm, David is speaking to God, and it's a great wonder that you and I can speak with God. He also not only is speaking to God, but he's speaking about God. He's speaking about God's greatness. He's declaring to God his own greatness. Therefore, it is a psalm about God. And he acknowledges this not merely in a doctrinal way, but in a relational way to himself and to his own life. So it is a psalm about God. It is a psalm about self. Throughout the psalm, David uses the title Lord 3 times, the word God 3 times, personal pronouns referring to him, thou, thine, thy, and thee, 30 times. So that's 36 direct references to God. Again, it is a psalm about God. But in the psalm, David also speaks of himself, using the personal pronouns I, me, thy, and mine 50 times. So David makes 86 references about God and himself. 86. So it is a psalm about God relating to self. From this, we see that in David's mind, there is a connection. There is a relationship between who God is and David's life. So our subject this afternoon is God and me. God and me. Two separate entities, yet connected. God and me. In the psalm, David, again with much reverence, meditates, contemplates upon some truths about God. I think that is something that we ought to do every day. We ought to take time just to think about God. Just to think about God. And these truths that he thinks upon show forth the awesomeness and the marvel and the greatness of God. And as he thinks upon these things, he's filled with awe. He's filled with wonder. He's filled with amazement. As seen in his words, O Lord, and O God, verse 1, verse 4, verse 17, verse 19. These are all points of exclamation as he thinks upon God. Notice that he begins his conversation with God with a point of exclamation. O Lord. Again, that little word O is an exclamation. So, David is filled with awe. He's filled with a wonder right from the beginning concerning God. This is also expressed in verse 6, where he says, such knowledge is too wonderful for me. You and I ought to be glad that we have a God that's too wonderful for us to contemplate. Wouldn't be much of a God if you and I could understand him fully. As David thinks upon these great truths concerning God, he also recognized their mystery and that they were beyond his comprehension. Verse 6 again, he says, I cannot attain unto it. And again, we ought to be glad that we have a God that is beyond our comprehension. The psalm is divided into 4 stanzas of 6 verses each. Each stanza focuses upon a specific truth concerning God. And in each of these truths are emphatically stated, that is, without any doubt, without any uncertainty whatsoever. And we ought to be glad that we have a God that is beyond our comprehension, but yet a God that we can have full assurance concerning. Again, David views these truths concerning God as they personally relate to himself. He sees these truths concerning God as connected and pertinent to himself. And we ought to be glad that we have a God that, though he's beyond our comprehension, he takes an interest in you and I, and of this we can be certain. As David thinks upon these truths, he's overwhelmed. And we ought to be glad that we have a God that overwhelms us. Wouldn't be much of a God if he didn't. As he thinks upon these great truths, he's personally moved. He's personally affected and impacted. And we ought to be glad that we have a God that His greatness moves and affects us. As David thinks upon these truths concerning with God, he's also filled with a desire toward Him, showing that these are not just mere points of theology, that these are not abstract, but they were realized by Him. And we ought to be glad that we have a God that is more than theology, that is beyond abstract. So let's look at the truths about God that are stated in this psalm. Again, all of these truths David speaks emphatically, with absolute certainty. He speaks emphatically about the knowledge of God. In verse 1, he emphatically states a general fact about the intimate, perfect, flawless, complete, and absolute knowledge of God. He says emphatically and with much assurance in verse 1, God knows me. God knows me. That is, right now, at this very moment, God knows me flawlessly, completely, and absolutely. Notice the words that David uses to describe this knowledge of God. In verse 1, he uses the words searched and known. So he states that God knows everything that I am. He knows everything about my character. He knows everything about my being. He knows who and what I am. There is absolutely nothing that He does not know about me. And then in verses 2 through 4, he mentions 7 specifics of this knowledge. And they're all in present tense. He says, Thou knowest. Present tense. Ongoing, always. Thou knowest my down sitting and my uprising. That's a figurative way of saying you know my every activity. He knows our every activity. Again, my down sitting and my uprising. Two opposites, implying that He knows everything in between. Down sitting and uprising. Notice verse 2, God knows everything I think. Thou understandest, again, present tense, ongoing always, my thought, afar off. He's saying God always knows what's upon my mind. He always sees what is in my thoughts. And He does so even before it's materialized in my thoughts, in my mind. He knows what you're going to think 5 seconds from now. He not only knows what we think now, He knows what you're going to think. And He knows what you have thought. We see also there's no thought that can be hidden from Him. But notice also verse 3, He knows everywhere I go. He says, Thou compassest, He discerns my path and my lying down, and acquainted with all my ways. The word my path has reference to our active public life. He knows. My lying down has reference to my private life. And He knows. And I believe my ways is a summary of both. God knows. God knows me whether I'm awake or asleep. God knows me whether I'm inside or outside. Whether I'm in public or in private. God knows. God knows. In verse 4, God knows everything that I say. And He knows everything that we're going to say before we say it. There's no escape from His knowledge of us. Verse 5, Thou hast beset. That is, God has surrounded and enclosed us by His knowledge. This is behind and before. God knows. He knows everything that I need. In verse 5, And laid thine hand upon me, which is a figure of speech, God's power in action, God exerting energy upon us. He's not simply a passive onlooker in our life. So we learn from this that there is no detail of my life that goes unnoticed by God. Nothing about me is excluded from the knowledge of God. Public or secret, He knows. He knows the motive. He knows the intent behind every action. He not only knows what we do, He knows why we do it. You may tell someone else why you do it, but may not be why. But God knows why. God knows why. He knows all things at all times at the same time. He states in verse 5 that every aspect of his life is surrounded by the knowledge of God. We ought to be glad that we have a God who knows us. That ought to give us confidence. That ought to give us great comfort. He's not blind. He's not ignorant of our condition or our circumstances. I'm never, ever out of the mind of God. And we ought to live in the awareness that He is perfectly aware. He is perfectly aware. That ought to make us careful. He knows me. That ought to fill us with humility. That ought to fill us with gratefulness. That ought to fill us with praise. For His love and His blessings to us are in spite of what He knows about us. And He knows the worst about us. He knows the worst about us. People will say often to comfort themselves, God knows my heart. Oh, yes, He does. And that may not be so comforting. He does know. In verse 6, David is overwhelmed by such. He says, such knowledge, that is, this knowledge of God, is too wonderful for me. It is high, cannot attain unto it. He then moves on and he speaks emphatically about the presence of God. And that is seen in verses 7 through 12. He asks a question in verse 7. Whither shall I go from thy spirit, or whither shall I flee from thy presence? Now I believe that question is not indicative of a desire of David to escape God's presence, but it's simply indicative of the fact that there is no place that I can go. There is no place where I can be that God is not. Whatever place you are in, God knows. He not only knows where you are, but He knows everything about you, as we've already seen. It is the truth stated in Jeremiah 23:24. There's no place you can go to hide from God. Because everywhere you go, God is there. In verse 8, he emphatically speaks of the vertical presence of God. Notice, if I ascend up into heaven, that's vertical. Thou art there. If I make my bed in hell, heaven and hell, vertical, behold, thou art there. If I can go to the highest place And if I were to go to the lowest place, God is there. And He's there in between the highest and the lowest. He says, Thou art there. Thou art there. That's always so. Thou art there. Verse 9, he speaks of the horizontal presence of God. He speaks of the wings of the morning. That is nearest and farthest. And he says, basically what he's saying is, if I could go from the east across the sky to the west, to the far side of the Mediterranean Sea, verse 10, even there. Even there. Even there. Again, absolute certainty. I'm glad that I have a God that is everywhere. And He is not only everywhere, but everywhere He is God. No place you can go where God isn't. And no place you can go where God isn't God. Here, there, and everywhere, God. No place has any effect upon who He is. Thou art there. Thou art there. He's speaking of God's presence for us. For you and I that are saved, those words, Thou art there. What that means is the infinite God is there for you and I, the finite. Sovereign God is there for us, His subjects. Almighty God is there for our weakness. Omniscient God is there for our ignorance. The all-sufficient God is there for our needs, for our poverty. This is a source of great confidence, source of great comfort. In every place, in every condition, in every company, in every circumstance, in every duty, we need to see the Lord with us. Psalm 16:8, the psalmist said, I have set the Lord always before me. That is, I see Him. Because He is at my right hand, I shall not be moved. So the presence of God, everywhere we go, there is God. Well, the presence of God gives us the opportunity to talk to Him. To talk to Him. Well, this isn't the place. Why not? God is there. You're there. Every place is a place to listen to Him. Every place is a place to lean upon Him and to draw from Him, to draw near to Him. Thou art there. He then speaks emphatically of the infinite power of God. Verses 13 through 18, and we looked at some of these verses this morning. In these verses, our attention is drawn to God as our personal Creator, which speaks of His power, His authority, His ownership, His rights as God. Again, everything is said with absolute certainty. Notice verse 13. Thou hast possessed my reins, Thou hast covered me in my mother's womb. Absolute certainty. No doubt about it in David's mind. Such a thought overwhelms him. And he says in verse 14, I will praise Thee, for I am fearfully and wonderfully made. And then you have verse 15 and 16. Exquisitely made by God on purpose and by God's design. handmade by God. Then he goes on, he speaks of the righteousness and the holiness of God. He begins verse 19 with surely, surely, assuredly, without question, most certainly, undoubtedly, without fail. Surely thou wilt slay the wicked. He is stating that God hates sin. He is stating the fact that God's justice will be executed in God's time. And when it is, it'll be right. Everything God does is right. He's never done anything that wasn't right. It'll be fair. I'm glad that I have a God that always does right. Always. Be careful what you complain about. God does all right. God does everything He does right. Then look at the practical effect that all of this had upon David. Again, he has, with absolute certainty and confidence and conviction, he's declared the omniscience of God. God knows me. He has declared the omnipresence of God. God is with me. He has declared the omnipotence of God. God has created and sustains me. And He has declared the absolute righteousness, holiness, and justice of God. Now, if we had asked when each one came into the building, do you believe that God knows everything about you? Everyone would have said, well, of course. I believe that. If we had asked you, do you believe that God is everywhere? Again, everyone would say, of course. God is everywhere. If we had asked, do you believe that God created you? Well, yes, I do. Do you believe God is righteous? That He's holy? That He's just? Everyone would have answered immediately, without any thought, yes. I believe all those things. And we do. These are all great and wonderful truths that we all believe. But the question is, again, the question is not whether or not we believe these things. We believe these things. But the question is, what effect do these things have upon our hearts? That's the question. The question is, what impact do they have upon our lives? That's what really matters. The structure of the psalm reveals that there is to be a connection between what we know and our demeanor and our attitude. There has to be a connection. There's a great disconnect today between what people say they believe and what they do. There's a great disconnect between the two. That should never be so. There ought to be a connection that leaves an impact upon our lives. Again, a connection between what we know and our demeanor and our attitude. The word "oh" occurs 6 times in the psalm. O Lord, 3 times. O God, 3 times. Again, it is a word of exclamation. It is a word that expresses deep feeling. It is a word that tells us that these truths that David has emphatically stated have an impact upon him. They have an effect upon him. In verse 4, there is the word lo, L-O. It is also a word of exclamation, a word expressing great wonder. And again, it shows us that there's an impact between what David knows and what he feels. Verse 8, there is the word behold. Also a word of exclamation, denoting something extraordinary, something momentous. Verse 12, there is the word yea, a word that expresses affirmation, agreement. It's a word of assurance and confidence. So the whole tone of the psalm is one of overwhelming wonder. And it's all connected to what he knew, to what he believed about God. And our knowledge of God ought to fill us with great wonder. It ought to do something to us. The psalm is an expression of one rejoicing that God is a part of his life and relates to every aspect of his life. The structure of the psalm also reveals that there ought to be a connection between what we know and what we desire to do. Again, the psalm is filled with emphatic statements and declarations about the greatness of God. And these thoughts and these beliefs evoke the desire and a resolve in David to praise him. He says in verse 14 again, I will praise thee. As he thinks upon God, I will praise thee. Verse 23 and 24. David expresses a desire of his heart. He says, search me, O God, and know my heart. Notice those 2 words. Search and know. Use those same 2 words in verse 1. In verse 1, it was something that he had experienced. He said in verse 1, O Lord, thou hast searched me and known me. And now he prays, search me, O God, and know my heart. He wants more. He'd already experienced it in verse 1. And by the time you get to the end of the psalm, he wants more. He's been thinking upon God. He's been meditating upon God. He's been declaring the greatness of God. This has an impact upon his desire. He wants more. He wants more of God. And the more you think upon God, the more you want Him in your life. The more of God you want. So the result of David realizing the greatness and the immensity and the majesty and the love and the care of God in his life, he's filled with a desire to have a deeper and closer relationship with the Lord. Verse 23 and 24 really is a prayer that reveals his sincerity and the longing of his heart. It is the prayer of one who has a vivid sense of God in his life. And he does not want anything to come in between him and God. And the more we think upon God, the more we desire, I don't want anything to come between me and God. What he's praying here in these last two verses, he's asking God to dig deep into him, to bring everything to the surface. Not that so God can know, God already knows, but so I can see. I can see what's in me. How many people, and I wonder if any of us really do, how many people really want to know everything there is to know about us? How many people are willing to have God bring everything to the surface? The things you've chosen to forget. Well, if you've chosen to forget it, it's obviously don't necessarily want it brought to the surface. He's saying, God, explore me. Probe into my being. Dig deep within me so that I can know who and what I am. So that I can know if there's anything or what stands between me and you. He is praying, Lord, put me to the test so that I can deal with what needs to be dealt with in my life. There are things in every one of our lives that needs to be dealt with. There are things in our attitudes that need to be dealt with. There are things in our priorities that need to be dealt with. They stand between us and God. There are things in our words that need to be dealt with. They stand between us and God. And the psalmist is praying here, reveal and make known to me so that I can confess and repent. When was the last time? Maybe there never has been a time. When you ask God, show me everything that's wrong with me so that I can confess it, so that I can make it right. This was the desire of David's heart. How did he get this desire? Simply meditating upon God. Meditating upon who God is. So reading the psalm, we see the expression of one impacted by the fact that there is a connection between me and God. In this psalm, we do not see the psalmist as one who wants merely information about God. It's more than just knowing about God in an intellectual way, in a religious way. It's good to have a knowledge about God. But know this, a knowledge about God by itself will leave you detached from Him and will leave you indifferent toward Him. But throughout the psalm, the psalmist is acknowledging God in his life. There was no disconnect. Throughout the psalm, David is very much aware, and he perceives God in his life. He speaks as one who is personally familiar with God. We can be familiar with this book, but we need to be familiar with the one who wrote the book. You can be familiar with the book and be detached from God. He speaks as one who knows God through personal experience. Throughout the psalm, David is delighting in God. He's finding pleasure and satisfaction that God is in his life. So God was a reality in his life. And the direction of his life is vitally connected with his degree of relationship with God. That's why it cannot be overstated, the importance of our relationship, personal relationship with God. There's nothing more important in your Christian life than a right understanding of who God is and a personal relationship with Him. And that becomes a propelling force in worship and the pursuit of holiness. So we need to make personal examination. Do we identify with David in this psalm? David gave much thought to who God is. And again, we need to do that. We need to take time every single day. I don't care if it's 5 minutes, but every day you need to get alone and just think upon God. Who He is. Who He is. Because there are many a day when many a child of God give no thought. No thought of God. None whatsoever. Again, it's just like the hog under the acorn tree. He's just feeding upon all those acorns, never once looks up to see where they're coming from. We're the same way. We feed upon the blessings of God, and many times we never consider where they come from. And perhaps worse yet, we give credit to where credit is not due. It's all of God. It's all of God. So we need to make personal examination. How does what we know about God relate to our lives? How does it relate to us personally? Brother Dave, if you'd come and lead us in a verse of song.